Welcome to our video on evolution, selection, and adaptation. There's some key terms you need to be familiar with while we're going through these slides. You have variation. Populations vary within their traits. Variation is a result of genetic differences that arise through mutations and/or sexual reproduction. Then you have selection pressure. This is a factor that results in differential survival and reproduction of individuals. You have fitness. This means some individuals are more successful at getting resources and are able to have more offspring. Then you have natural selection, and this is the frequency of certain traits in a population changing from one generation to the next. The outcome is adaptation. And then you have our final term, evolution. This is genetic change in a population over time, descent with modification. It occurs via several mechanisms. Natural selection and sexual selection are just two of those mechanisms. For this video, we're going to focus on natural selection. To explain these key terms, we're going to focus on a group of birds known as Darwin's finches. Within these birds, we have three beak sizes. You have small, medium, and large. Researchers have discovered that beak size is dependent on variations of one gene called HMGA2. Birds with large beaks specialize on eating larger seeds. The diet of birds with small beaks tends to focus mainly on small seeds, whereas those with medium beaks can eat both small and large seeds, but they do better with seeds in between those sizes. So there are three categories of selection pressure. You have stabilizing selection, you have directional selection, and you have disruptive selection. Stabilizing selection narrows the distribution of the population, so the extremes, those with, in this case, large and small beaks, would have been selected against, and those with medium-sized beaks would have been selected for. You have directional selection, where there's a shift in the distribution from left to right or right to left. Then you have disruptive selection. This is where the extremes are selected for. So with our example, those with larger beaks and smaller beaks would have a higher fitness level, whereas those with medium-sized beaks would be selected against. Between the years 2003 and 2004, there was a drought. And because plants that produce large and medium seeds need a lot of water to distribute resources to seed production, they were unable to do so. However, plants with small seeds were still able to produce their seeds. This allowed for selection against medium and large beak birds, and small beak birds were able to flourish. This is an example of directional selection, where one extreme trait is favored over the others. Because individuals with small beaks survive more often, there would be more of them to make chicks. This would lead to more chicks with small beaks being born in the next generation. This increase in small beak size from one generation to the next is what we know as descent with modification, otherwise known as evolution. But these are micro changes, or changes within the same group. What about macro changes, such as the development of a new species? Well, these small changes do lead to big changes and result in speciation events. For example, if you look at the top sentence, we can agree that this text is red. The next sentence, we can also agree that this text is blue. If we have red text and decide to change it by just small amounts, the change might barely be noticeable, but still a small change. This we will call our microevolution. Every word up till now can be considered red, with very minute changes in the hue. If we keep trying long enough, would anyone be able to tell me just by looking at which word or letter is this post no longer red, but actually purple or blue? All these micro changes keep occurring in the text with its tiny changes in hue, but ultimately I end up with a completely different color. It's actually the difference between what one would consider red and what one would consider purple, or a whole new species in this analogy, which is macroevolution. See, the common misunderstanding is that macroevolution means a dog being a direct offspring of some other different canine-like species, or even more ignorantly, a cat coming from a dog. Well, that's not what macroevolution is. There is really only one distinction between microevolution and macroevolution, and it's the same distinction between their prefixes, micro and macro. Just like if something is microscopic or if something is macroscopic. Microscopic usually requires a microscope to see because it's so small. But the macroscopic are things large enough to be seen by the common human eye. However, things of both sizes are completely visible and plainly exist. And there are many things in this universe between both general sizes. So as you read this, can you tell me the first word here that is blue and not purple? After all, every change in color since the first word in this paragraph has only micro-evolved from the color next to it. But we've managed to macro-evolve through two colors. This hopefully will illustrate how it's illogical to believe that macroevolution doesn't happen, even given enough time for microevolution to occur. So tell me, what was the first purple word in the block of the text above? What's the first blue word? Remember, if macroevolution simply cannot happen, then you're saying the words you are reading now are still red. So it's not as if a Great Dane gave birth to kittens. In fact, kittens and Great Danes share a common ancestor, just as they share a common ancestor with weasels and skunks. So when we talk about common ancestors, it's nice to have an idea of what that last common ancestor might have looked like. And it's even better if we have an analogous species alive today. And we have just that. This is known as the pine marten. It's related to weasels, but it shares a lot of characteristics that we see in all carnivores. So it's a good stand-in for the last common ancestor. This is the phylogenetic tree of Carnivora. But I want to draw your attention to the red box, which is encompassing the pinnipeds. Pinnipeds include things such as fur seals, elephant seals, leopard seals, and other types such as walruses and sea lions. So the closest living relative to pinnipeds are the Mustelidae, which include things such as river otters, minks, ferrets, and weasels. So because the last common ancestor of Carnivora looked like this little guy, we can assume the ancestral paw of both seals and weasels looks similar to this. So it's easy to see how the ancestral paw can go from what we see on the left to what we see on the right. But it's harder to understand how an ancestral paw can give rise to a flipper. But that's because you're looking at the beginning and end result, the ancestral paw and the seal's flipper. You're not seeing the entire picture, the small intermediate steps in between. So let's say we have a population, this last common ancestor, and a population of them begins to hunt on the shoreline. And as the generations go on, they start spending more and more time in the water. And those individuals who are more successful at getting food are the ones that are able to survive. Those that are able to catch fish more often are able to have more offspring. So characteristics that give them that benefit would be selected for. So you would start seeing members of this group having more webbing between their toes. Now, we have a population of an ancestor with more webbed toes. And they begin swimming further and further out into the water. And those individuals with even more developed webbing are able to swim further than the individuals with just the slight webbing. And again, a few generations later, we see individuals pop up with even more webbing because the individuals that are able to swim further and faster and deeper are able to get more food. And a few generations later, we see paws that are nearly flippers. They look almost flipper-like. Let's fast forward a little bit further, and now we have animals that are spending a lot more time in the water. Their flippers look less like flippers and more like flat paws. And then a few generations later, we get more aerodynamics. And we start developing what looks more like a flipper. We still have claws though, but we keep going. And finally, we have a full-fledged flipper without any claws at all, and barely any reference marks to let you know that there are any digits inside the flipper. What's interesting is for this example, I used living members of both groups, Mustelidae and pinnipeds. So you just saw the paws and the flippers of elephant seals, leopard seals, fur seals, and 3 types of otters, and a mink, and a weasel. And these differences aren't only skin deep. If we were to look inside these 2 flippers, we would see that harbor seals on the right still have claws projecting from their flipper, whereas the long-nosed fur seal has lost that trait, and their tips of their finger bones have recessed into the flipper. Whereas the harbor seal, their digits go all the way to the end of the flipper. The fur seal, they actually have a meaty flap in between the bones and the end of the flipper. So when we talk about microevolution, what we mean is the entire picture, every sequence of events between the ancestral trait and the descendant trait. But when we talk about macroevolution, we're talking about the beginning and end products. Now, based on this line of thought, it would be safe for us to assume that there must have been some ancient member of the seal family that had more paw-like than flipper-like appendages. And that's exactly what scientists found when they found P. darwini. Now, a number of people have said that this looks like an otter alive today. So how do we know that this is a seal and not an ancient otter? Along with a number of other techniques, researchers compared skull measurements, looking at things such as the size of the eye socket, the position of the eye socket, shape of the teeth, number of teeth, and other key features within the skulls of river otters and seals and this P. darwini. And they concluded that this is an ancient seal. And comparing skull shape and morphology is what you guys are going to be doing in this next lab.